how could an ordinary guy explain to people living in a basically decent, fairly normal sort of society what they've been through? I mean, they've been to hell and back again and beyond.
You know, it wasn't understood at the time. Post-traumatic stress syndrome, you know, absolutely pervasive among NZEF veterans. But how much was it understood? Very little.
Oh, no question. No question of it. New Zealand had no experience like this before. There'd been the Boer War, of course, and the New Zealanders killed in the Boer War stayed in South Africa, but they were relatively few compared with the numbers of the First World War.
And so many of those men died young or enacted domestic violence on their families or psychological violence on themselves. You know, they carried that burden with them throughout their long lives sometimes, their relatively short lives for others, and there really was very little in place to support them in those difficulties.
The main thrust of it was to put guys on farms, and about 9,000 of them are put onto farms. By the middle of the 20s, 3,000 of them have failed already. It was doomed to failure because a lot of them went very well, or they were, even if they looked okay, they were still struggling with what they used to call shell shock, what we would call post-traumatic stress. And they were in remote places, and the land quality was very poor. Many of the sections were too small, or prone to flooding, or prone to drought. All those things in combination made it very difficult. And many of them were just city boys and never a clue how to farm anyway, and they weren't given much help.
And neighbourhoods in those days were much more familiar with people because they walked across the street. And you walked to work and you went past every house and you knew people in every house. Not like today when we're in cars and we're moving about. And we have those senses of connections in Eden, even in our more atomised society, much more pervasive in the society of World War I. So people were linked with other people in their neighbourhoods and their churches and their lodges and their groups. And yes, every group had been touched by loss profoundly.
Remember, the other real special problem we had was the lack of bodies. So you're going to grieve, you've got to have a body. And this is why there's so many memorials in New Zealand and Australia, because 80+% in each case are buried somewhere overseas. My hunch is that a lot of the difficulties associated with the lack of bodies really starts to bite as these celebrations, in inverted commas, are going on. And that's why we've got over 550 war memorials scattered around the country. They're kind of surrogate community graveyards in a way.
They are surrogate graves, and after the war, immediately after the war in 1923, in fact, the first party of rich New Zealanders went to the battlefields to see the graves of their loved ones. But they're only the people who could afford that, and there weren't many. They just couldn't afford, the average New Zealander couldn't afford to do it. And so that's why people in New Zealand contributed to these war memorials. They weren't built with public funds generally, or certainly not central government funds, some local government funds, but generally it was donation that led to all these memorials being built.
New Zealand, as a society, had never had to deal with such a quantum of trauma amongst such a substantial group of its citizens.
We're phlegmatic and tough, but this was a particularly nasty war.